Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Dundas Streetcar, a streetcar route that could arguably be considered the middle of the pack as far as Toronto streetcar routes are concerned. So, let's get into the video. Before we get into the history of the Dundas Streetcar, I must first explain the history of Dundas Street itself, since I will be referencing roads which no longer exist in this video. This is because the Dundas Street we know today, at least in downtown Toronto, is a Frankenstein's monster of a road made up of various smaller roads that were stitched together. If you have ever been along Dundas Street, you may notice the large number of bends in the road. This is where the old roads were realigned to form the single continuous road we know today. Dundas Street was created in 1796 as a concession road running from Cootes Paradise, today the village of Dundas in Hamilton, to Toronto. Within Toronto, the road would run from the Etobicoke Creek to Old Mill along what we know as Bloor Street today. In 1811, a completely separate Dundas Street was built running from what is today the intersection of Ossington Avenue and Queen Street, north and then northwest following the Dundas Street West we know today, linking up with the other Dundas Street at what is today the intersection of Dundas Street, Bloor Street, and Kipling Avenue. The two Dundases would be merged and the old segment of road to Old Mill would become part of Bloor Street. Within downtown Toronto, Dundas Street dove south at what is today Ossington Avenue. So what was happening east of it? Well, Ossington Avenue to Bathurst Street was called Arthur Street. From Bathurst Street to McCall Street was St. Patrick Street, not to be confused with the St. Patrick Street that exists today, which was called William Street at the time. From McCall Street to University Avenue was Anderson Street. From University Avenue to Yonge Street was Agnes Street. From Yonge Street to George Street was Crookshank Street. From George Street to Sherbourne Street was Wilton Crescent. From Sherbourne Street to River Street was Beach Street. And lastly, on the other side of the Don River was Elliott Street, which connected to Broadview Avenue. Eventually, all of these roads would be cobbled together to form the Dundas Street we know today, and the old segment south to Queen Street would become Ossington Avenue. Now, with that out of the way, we can get into the history of the Dundas Streetcar itself. The origins of the Dundas Streetcar trace back to 1882 when the Brockton Streetcar began operation. The line would operate from the intersection of Front Street and George Street, north and then west along King Street to Yonge Street. From there, north to Queen Street and west along Queen Street to Dundas Street. The route would then follow Dundas Street to the city limit at Dufferin Street. The Brockton Streetcar would officially enter the village of Brockton in 1884 when it was extended west to Lansdowne Avenue. The village of Brockton would be annexed by the city of Toronto a year later in 1885. The Brockton Streetcar would begin electrified operation on October 9, 1893, and would be renamed as the Dundas Streetcar. On April 14, 1894, a shuttle service would begin operations along a single-track line from Lansdowne Avenue to the city limit at Humberside Avenue. By March 11, 1895, all Dundas streetcars would run to Humberside Avenue. On December 23, 1899, the Toronto Railway Company would gain running rights into the village of West Toronto, and so the Dundas Streetcar would be extended west to Keele Street, where it would connect with services provided by the Toronto Suburban Railway. You can watch my video about the Davenport and Rogers Road streetcars to learn more about them and their successor, the Township of York Railway. Streetcar service east of what is today Ossington Avenue would begin on February 12, 1902 with the introduction of the Arthur Streetcar. This route would run from Dundas Street east along Arthur Street to Bathurst Street and then south to King Street. On November 6, 1903, the Arthur Streetcar would be extended south on Bathurst Street to Front Street and then east to George Street. A month later, on December 18th, it would be extended west along Dundas Street to Lansdowne Avenue. On July 14, 1907, the Arthur Streetcar would be realigned with the route now beginning at the intersection of Lansdowne Avenue and Bloor Street. The route would run south to Dundas Street and then east along Dundas Street and Arthur Street. It would then run south on Bathurst Street, east on Queen Street, south on York Street, and east on Richmond Street to Victoria Street before looping around via Queen Street. In 1909, the Dundas and Arthur streetcars would be merged, forming a single route, as by this time the Toronto Railway Company began to see Dundas Street as its own corridor in need of a feeder service bringing suburban residents into downtown Toronto. The newly merged route would run from Keele Street along Dundas Street and Arthur Street to Bathurst Street, south on Bathurst Street and east along Queen Street, looping via York Street, Richmond Street, and Victoria Street. Service on the southern section of Dundas Street would be handed over to the Dovercourt streetcar. At some point in the 1910s, the Dundas streetcar would be rerouted off of Bathurst Street and instead run east along St. Patrick Street, Anderson Street, and Agnes Street to Raleigh Street, which is now called Bay Street. The route would then run south to Queen Street and follow its normal looping pattern. In 1916, the City of Toronto would officially merge all of these little roads into a single Dundas Street, continuing from what is now Ossington Avenue to Broadview Avenue. Service east of Raleigh Street didn't exist at this time as there was no tracks between Raleigh Street and Victoria Street. There were tracks between Victoria Street and Parliament Street, however, and these were being used by the Winchester streetcar at the time. When the Toronto Transportation took over streetcar operations in 1921, as part of their overhaul of the streetcar network, they would extend the tracks along Dundas Street. This included the installation of new tracks from Parliament Street to Broadview Avenue, new tracks from Keele Street to a new streetcar loop at Runnymede Road, and new tracks between Victoria Street and Bay Street, thus closing the gap and unifying all of Dundas Street's tracks. These new tracks east of Bay Street, however, would not be used by the Dundas streetcar. Instead, it would be the College streetcar that would use them, and you can learn more about this in my video on the Carleton streetcar. The Dundas streetcar would, however, still see a change in service, as it would be extended west from Keele Street to the new Runnymede Loop. The east end of the line would also be rerouted through City Hall Loop, running counterclockwise around Bay Street, Albert Street, James Street, and Louisa Street. It would share this loop with the DuPont streetcar. The intersection of Bay Street and Dundas Street would become a hotbed of streetcar congestion due to the presence of the Dundas, DuPont, Bay, and College streetcars all running through the intersection. To get around this, the TTC would open an expanded City Hall Loop on November 3, 1930. The loop itself would remain the same. However, the tracks along Louisa and Albert Streets would be extended to and along Elizabeth Street to Dundas Street. This would give the Dundas streetcar access to City Hall Loop without having to deal with the madhouse at Bay and Dundas. On April 13, 1933, the Dundas streetcar would be joined by the Harvard streetcar, which replaced the service formerly provided by the College streetcar, with the two routes sharing Dundas Street between Spadina Avenue and Bay Street. The Dundas streetcar would continue to operate this route even up until the opening of the Yonge subway in 1954. Dundas streetcars would continue to terminate at City Hall Loop, with the only change coming on June 4, 1961, when a portion of Elizabeth Street was closed to make way for Toronto's new City Hall. The Dundas streetcar would simply access City Hall Loop via Bay Street like it used to before 1930. It wasn't until the opening of the Bloor-Danforth subway in 1966 and the abolition of the Harvard streetcar that the Dundas streetcar would take on the route we know today. With the Harvard streetcar gone, service on the Dundas streetcar would finally begin operating east of Bay Street, running to Broadview Station. However, only every second car would make this run. All others would continue to terminate at City Hall Loop. This was due to the lower ridership on the eastern end of the line compared to the western end. As well, even with the opening of the Bloor-Danforth line and Dundas West Station, Dundas streetcars would continue to operate beyond to Runnymede Loop and would do so until May 10, 1968, when it was replaced by the 40 Junction bus. Even though the Harvard streetcar terminated at what would become Pape Station, the TTC never had any plan to continue streetcar service to it through the Dundas streetcar. As well, there were no plans to continue the Dundas streetcar along Dundas Street, which runs to Kingston Road, although the TTC did consider setting up a bus route or even a trolley bus route along Dundas Street East. In the 1970s, as part of the planned Eaton Center development, service to City Hall Loop was suspended. This was only planned to be temporary at first, as the idea was the loop would remain and allow streetcar service directly to the Eaton Center's doors. The Eaton's company would, however, decide against this proposal, and so City Hall Loop would disappear from the streetcar network. Dundas streetcars would instead begin looping via Queen Street, Church Street, and Victoria Street on January 6, 1975. With the introduction of the CLRV streetcars, the Dundas streetcar would be given the number 505. By the 1980s, all 505 Dundas cars were operating to Broadview Station, while the short-term service into the downtown loop had become rush hour only. On June 20th, 1986, this short-term service would be ended for good, and now the 505 Dundas would operate as it does today from Dundas West Station to Broadview Station. In 1997, the TTC would consider bringing back the old short-term service as its own independent line called the Eaton Center streetcar. It would have run from Spadina Station to the loop via Church Street, Queen Street, and Victoria Street. The TTC would end up dropping this proposal as the inconvenience in headways caused to the 510 Spadina and 505 Dundas outweighed any potential benefit this route may have had. In 2000, the TTC would briefly consider rerouting the 505 Dundas streetcar to Pape Station via Gerrard Street, Carlaw Avenue, Riverdale Avenue, and Pape Avenue, following the old Harvard streetcar route. This was in an effort to solve the congestion problem at Broadview Station, which at the time only had one track and platform to serve two streetcar lines. The TTC would instead opt to expand Broadview Station, and so the extension of the 505 Dundas to Pape Station would never occur. As for the future of the 505 Dundas, there is at least one proposal that has a good chance of happening. That being rerouting the 505 Dundas out of Broadview Station and instead running the line to the planned Gerrard Station on the Ontario line. Whether or not this change happens immediately is unknown, but the plans for a Broadview streetcar make it seem more likely that this change will occur at some point. With the development of the Portlands area, the TTC is planning on reintroducing the Broadview streetcar, which was abolished back in 1923. The route would run from Broadview Station into the Portlands, although its exact route is unknown at this time. This will have an effect on the 505 Dundas, as Broadview Station only has capacity for two streetcar lines, and the 504 King streetcar also terminates at Broadview. There is no room at Broadview Station for the addition of a third track and platform. A resurrected Broadview streetcar will require either the 504 or 505 to be relocated out of Broadview Station to free up space. The 505 Dundas will almost certainly be the route that gets moved, with its new terminus being the future Gerrard Station, where the TTC is planning on building a turnback loop. Another proposal, although a lot less certain, is an extension of the 505 Dundas west along Dundas Street west to Jane Street, where it would connect with an extended St. Clair streetcar. The extension of the 512 St. Clair to Jane Street, however, has always been one of those perennial plans that always seems to come and go but never gets built. Recently, the TTC has also eyed the possibility of building a new car house along St. Clair Avenue, and if that is done, then we may see tracks reinstalled along Dundas Street West to allow a secondary access to the car house. Whether or not the 505 Dundas streetcar itself operates beyond Dundas West Station like it used to, however, is anyone's guess. The TTC will likely point to the low ridership of the 40 Junction bus, which replaced the former streetcar service, as a reason to not reinstate revenue service even if the tracks are installed. But with that, I will end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Dundas Streetcar, don't be afraid to do so in the comments section down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.